Today, I will reveal to you 30 chambers of this archive, 30 stories that you believed were unshakable truths. Get ready, for what you will learn will make you question everything you were taught. The truth I will unveil will be more fantastic, crazier, and more touching than any myth. Myth number 1. The silent swan song of the Snowy King. Imagine the mirror-like surface of a lake at twilight. Silence, interrupted only by the gentle splash of water. In this scene, beneath the rays of the setting sun, glides a majestic white bird, a swan, a symbol of purity, loyalty, and aristocratic grace. For centuries, poets, from Aesop to Ovid, from Tchaikovsky to Saint-Saëns, have woven one heart-wrenching detail into their works. Just before the end of its journey, in that final moment, the swan pours its soul into a farewell, unbelievably beautiful song. This swan song has become a metaphor for the last masterpiece, the final gesture of genius, the last chord of a great life. We willingly believed in this, for this legend grants beauty and meaning to departure. It transforms a prosaic ending into a tragic opera, where nature itself becomes the composer. We listened intently to the silences of lakes, hoping to catch the echoes of this last aria, passing this beautiful lie from generation to generation. We wanted to believe that even in nature there is a place for the high art of farewell, that departure can be not an end, but a final, vibrant splash. This belief comforted us and inspired us. It was so poetic that it felt like truth. And no one dared to doubt it, for shattering such a beautiful myth would be akin to breaking a precious porcelain figurine. However, the archives of nature hold a different, much more prosaic truth. Step into any ornithological library, open the dusty tomes of observations, and you will find not a single line confirming this myth. The truth is that swans do not sing before they die, not at all. Their usual sounds are trumpet-like calls, hissing, and clattering. In the moment of agony, when the death spasm tightens the lungs, a raspy, gurgling sound might escape the bird's throat, but it bears no resemblance to a melodic song. This is a sound of struggle, not of resignation. The myth was born in ancient Greece, where the swan was associated with the god Apollo, the patron of the arts. In Plato's Phaedo, he attributed to Socrates the saying that swans sing from joy, anticipating their meeting with their god. This philosophical metaphor was taken literally and spread across the world, growing new poetic details along the way. Yet the reality is much simpler and harsher. The swan departs in silence. Its majesty lies in life, not in a farewell performance. The myth proved more resilient than the truth, because humanity has always needed a beautiful story to reconcile it with the inevitable. We endowed the bird with human emotions and talents to make the world around us a little more meaningful and less cruel. We created a symphony where silence reigned. And this self-deception turned out to be so sweet that we continue to believe in it to this day. From this beautiful yet empty musical box of nature, we move on to another misconception rooted in our desire to see our own virtues reflected in the animal kingdom. This time, the virtue of relentless hard work. Myth number 2. The Legion of Sleepy Workers. Think back to the fable you heard in childhood. The carefree grasshopper that sang all summer long, and the ant, a paragon of foresight and diligence, laboring under a heavy burden to prepare for winter. This image has embedded itself in our minds. The ant has become synonymous with tireless work, a tiny mechanism that never stops moving. We envision an ant colony as a gigantic factory operating 3 shifts without breaks or weekends, where each little worker ant fulfills its role from dawn till dusk for the common good. This picture has served as a powerful social metaphor. Entire ideologies have been built around this image of collective, selfless labor. We were told, "Be like the ant," and we believe that the success of society depends on the continuous, round-the-clock work of each member. The myth of the workaholic ant was convenient. It justified overwork, glorified sacrifice, and created the illusion that nature itself blesses such a way of life. We looked at the lines of ants scurrying along pathways and saw an army of ideal proletarians, oblivious to fatigue. It seemed as though evolution had crafted this perfect being, free from laziness and the need for rest. We applauded their diligence, unaware that we were actually applauding our own illusions. But if we could look inside the anthill not as poets, but as scientists, we would find a picture that would shatter this myth to its core. Modern myrmecology, the science of ants, has used tiny radio tags and cameras to lift the veil on their underground world. And what did we see? Rest. Lots of rest. It turns out that at any given time, a significant portion of the ant colony, sometimes up to half, is doing absolutely nothing. They are not simply resting, they are sleeping. They go through cycles of activity and rest that closely resemble our own. The worker ants we see on the surface are just the tip of the iceberg. Below ground are their shift workers, recovering their strength. Moreover, there is a clear division of labor within the colony, and some ants can be considered real slackers, or rather reservists. They only spring into action during emergencies, like enemy attacks or the urgent need to evacuate larvae. The efficiency of the ant colony lies not in the relentless work of every member, but in smart organization, a system of shifts, a reserve, and specialization. Nature has proven to be wiser than our ideologues. It understands that burnout is a poor survival strategy for a species. The truth is that ants are not workaholics, but masters of time management. This myth endured for so long because it was simple and instructive. The reality, however, is more complex and teaches us that it's not endless labor, but effective resource allocation and timely rest that lead to prosperity. From the myth of eternal labor, we now shift to the myth of fleeting life, to the tale of another insect whose existence we have also transformed into a beautiful but false parable. Myth number 3, the mayfly that lived for months. Its image is pure poetry. A delicate creature, painted in all the colors of the rainbow, it emerges into the world for just one brief day to share its beauty before vanishing with the sunset. The day-flying butterfly. This phrase has become synonymous with everything fleeting, transient, but beautiful. Artists have depicted it on their canvases as a symbol of life's transience, and philosophers have used it as a metaphor for carpe diem, seize the day. We watched the butterfly flitting over flowers and thought, it lives for only one day. What tragic beauty. This idea lent each flap of its wings an existential significance. We believed it because it made the world more dramatic and poetic. The concept of a creature whose life spans a single daylight hour was captivating. It taught us to value each moment. It was a lovely, sorrowful tale we told ourselves as we gazed at the fragile flight of its vibrant wings. Yet, it never occurred to anyone that this story was merely a product of our imagination and confusion. We were so enchanted by the symbol that we forgot to look at the real creature. So, let's open an old entomology textbook and trace the true life journey of this being. The truth is that the vast majority of butterflies live far longer than just one day. Their life, when counted from the moment they emerge from their chrysalis, lasts anywhere from several weeks to several months. For instance, the common cabbage white or tortoiseshell butterflies flutter around gardens for 2 to 3 weeks. Some species are true long livers within the insect world. The monarch butterfly, famous for its transcontinental migrations, can live up to 9 months. Imagine that. This tiny creature travels thousands of kilometers, a feat that would be physically impossible if its life were constrained to just 24 hours. So, where did this myth come from? Most likely, it emerged from confusion with another insect, the mayfly, ephemera, whose adult stage is indeed very short, sometimes lasting only a few hours. However, even mayflies have a larval stage that lives in water for several years. We simply transferred the tragic fate of one species onto another, more beautiful and conspicuous one. The myth has proven resilient because a poetic image is always stronger than a dull scientific fact. A butterfly that lives for 9 months sounds somewhat ordinary, but the day-flying butterfly is a ready-made storyline for a ballad. We sacrifice truth for a beautiful metaphor, and while we continue to admire the fabricated tragedy of the butterfly, we overlook its real wonder, the wonder of resilience, longevity, and incredible journeys. From the misconception of life's fleetingness, let's now move to the myth of purpose, to the story of a creature whose grand constructions we have also misinterpreted. Myth number 4, fortresses built for peace. In the tranquil cove of a forest river stands a structure that could be the envy of any self-taught engineer. A dam made of branches, mud, and stones stands strong and sturdy, blocking the flow and creating an entirely new lake. Its builder? The beaver. In our minds, it has become known as a brilliant engineer. For centuries, we believed that the primary purpose of these grand structures was protection. We imagined beavers, those peaceful workers, constructing their dams to create an impregnable fortress surrounded by a deep moat where their little homes would be safe from predators like wolves, lynxes, and bears. The scene was heroic. Tiny engineers standing up to the wild, building defensive lines. This version made sense and was easy to understand. Protection is one of the basic instincts, and as humans, we're used to building walls and fortresses for that reason. We simply imposed our own logic onto the animal world. We looked at the dam and saw an analogy to a medieval castle, complete with moats and drawbridges. The myth of the beaver as a protector was so convincing because it made the animal's actions seem purposeful from a human perspective. It transformed the beaver from a mere rodent into a strategist and tactician. But what if the true reason for this grand construction is much simpler yet equally elegant? Let's look into nature's blueprints instead of our own human assumptions. Revealed archives from zoologists tell us that the primary purpose of a dam is not to protect against enemies at all. Its main task is to raise the water level. Why? It all comes down to how a beaver's lodge is designed. The entrance is always underwater. It's a brilliant solution, but it only works if the water level is stable and high enough to conceal this entrance. If the river runs low, the entrance will be exposed, leaving the lodge vulnerable. Therefore, the beaver builds a dam to create an artificial reservoir with consistent depth. It's not a military engineer, but rather a specialist in hydrology and irrigation. The beaver alters the landscape not for warfare, but for comfort and safety in daily life. Protecting against predators is merely a secondary effect. Of course, deep water makes it harder for predators to access the lodge, but that's just a pleasant bonus, not the primary goal. The truth is that the beaver is not a fortress builder. It's a creator of ecosystems. Its dams change the hydrological regime, creating wetlands that become home to hundreds of other species. The myth of protection was popular because it appealed to our understanding of war and defense. But reality speaks of creation and environmental change. We saw a soldier in the beaver, yet it turned out to be a landscape architect. Now, let's shift from the natural world, which we so often anthropomorphize, to the realm of humans, to the story of great minds whose achievements we've also simplified into beautiful yet inaccurate legends. Myth number 5. The theorem stolen from eternity. Close your eyes and imagine ancient Greece. The sun shines down on the marble steps of the academy. A sage in a white tunic, surrounded by students, draws a triangle in the sand. This is Pythagoras. In a moment of brilliant insight, he writes down a formula that will change geometry forever. The square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides. Students are thrilled as 100 bulls are sacrificed to the gods, and from that moment on, this fundamental truth bears his name, the Pythagorean theorem. This story has become so firmly entrenched in school textbooks and our minds that it has transformed into an axiom. Pythagoras discovered the theorem, period. We believe this because history loves lone heroes, geniuses who changed the world in a single stroke. We embrace the idea that great discoveries have specific authors and precise dates of birth. It organizes the chaos of history, turning it into a gallery of great individuals. The myth of Pythagoras is the perfect example of such simplification. It paints a clear and beautiful picture. There was chaos, then Pythagoras arrived, and order was restored. We readily accepted this narrative because it is so easy to remember and flattering to the power of human intellect. But what if this brilliant sage was not so much an original discoverer as a skilled compiler and popularizer? Let's take a look back at archives that predate ancient Greece. 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born, calculations showcasing a wonderful understanding of the relationships in right triangles were already inscribed on clay tablets in Babylon. Babylonian scribes used what are known as Pythagorean triples, like 3, 4, 5, to solve practical problems, building canals, measuring fields. They didn't derive a universal formula, but they empirically understood this principle. Now, let's jump to ancient Egypt. Hundreds of years before Pythagoras, Egyptian harpedonopti, or rope stretchers, used ropes divided by knots into 12 equal parts to construct perfectly straight angles. They created a triangle with sides 3, 4, and 5, intuitively applying the very theorem. Evidence of this knowledge can also be found in ancient texts from India and China. So, what is Pythagoras' contribution? He was likely the first to provide a rigorous mathematical proof of this theorem. He translated the practical knowledge of craftsmen into the language of abstract logic and philosophy. He didn't discover it, he proved and systematized it, fitting it into the grand picture of harmony in the world that his school sought. Yet, the myth of discovery turned out to be much more appealing than the painstaking work of generalizing existing knowledge. We preferred the story of a sudden genius's spark to the slow evolution of thought. The reality is that great ideas rarely originate in one mind. They hover in the air, maturing for centuries across different cultures until someone shapes them into their ideal form. Pythagoras may not have ignited this fire, but he turned it into an eternal flame. From one great name, whose role was exaggerated, let's move to another, whose coronation seems to have been an act of spontaneity rather than cold calculation. Myth number 6. A crown born from chaos. Christmas in the year 800. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. An enormous crowd stands in reverent awe. The mighty king of the Franks, Charles, still not yet the Great, kneels in prayer. And at that moment, Pope Leo III, as if moved by divine inspiration, approaches him from behind and places an imperial crown upon his head. The crowd erupts with shouts, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-loving emperor of the Romans, life and victory." According to his biographer, Charles was taken by surprise and even angered, as he did not desire this title. For centuries, this scene has been portrayed as a spontaneous, almost mystical act. The Pope, inspired from above, and the humble king, not seeking glory, are the heroes of this drama. We believe this story because it idealized the birth of a new empire. It presented the event not as a result of political intrigue, but as divine providence. The spontaneity of the coronation cleansed it of any suspicion of collusion or usurpation of power. It created an image of Charles as God's chosen one, rather than an ambitious ruler. This myth served both the Church, which asserted its right to appoint emperors, and the empire itself, which gained sacred legitimacy. The picture was too beautiful to be a lie, a gesture of despair and hope from the Pope, who finally found a defender for Rome. But what if this theatrical gesture concealed a meticulously planned political spectacle? Let's set aside the panegyrics and delve into the dry chronicles of the political reality of that time. Pope Leo III was in a desperate situation. The Roman nobility accused him of perjury and immorality. They attempted to blind him and cut out his tongue, forcing him to flee Rome under Charles's protection. He desperately needed a powerful patron to restore his power and authority. Charles, in turn, was already the de facto ruler of Western Europe. He just lacked the title to equal himself with the Emperor of Byzantium and officially solidify his status. The coronation was beneficial for both. It was a meticulously thought-out symbiosis. Charles received the imperial title and sacred status, while the Pope gained protection and recognition of his right to crown kings. Charles's surprise was likely part of the performance, a ritual gesture of humility meant to show that he accepted power not from pride, but by the will of God and the people. The entire ceremony was staged from beginning to end. The myth of spontaneity lived on for so long because it transformed cynical political bargaining into a sacred act. It hid behind the curtain of divine intervention the cold calculations of the two most influential individuals in Europe. The truth is that the Holy Roman Empire was born not from a surge of inspiration, but from a well-thought-out deal. From kings whose deeds have become legendary, let's move to a simple peasant, whose name became a symbol of a heroic deed by the people, one that perhaps was never actually accomplished. Myth number 7. The guide who stepped into legend. Winter of 1613, a time of turmoil. Through the snowy Kostroma forests, a Polish-Lithuanian detachment moves, searching for the way to the village of Domnino to capture and kill the newly elected Tsar Mikhail Romanov. They enlist a local peasant, Ivan Suzanin, as their guide. Understanding that he is leading the enemies to his master's doom, he makes a momentous decision. He pretends to agree but leads the detachment into impenetrable swamps. When the deception is uncovered, the Poles, in a fit of rage, torture and kill him, only to perish themselves in the depths of the forest. The Tsar is saved, and the name of Suzanin becomes a symbol of self-sacrifice, patriotism, and national wisdom. This story is familiar to everyone from their school days. Glinka's opera Life for the Tsar immortalized his heroism in music, while monuments and paintings captured it in stone and color. We believed wholeheartedly in this act of bravery. It was needed. It provided the common people with a hero, proving that the fate of the country is determined not only by the nobility, but also by an ordinary peasant. During the era of national consciousness in the 19th century, the myth of Suzanin became one of the cornerstones of patriotic education. It was vivid, straightforward, and incredibly inspiring. It taught that love for the motherland is greater than one's own life. Against the backdrop of such a noble idea, no one wanted to sift through dusty and potentially disappointing documents. But what if this magnificent monument to the people's spirit stands on an unstable foundation? Let's turn to the few historical sources available. The sole document from that time mentioning Suzanin is a letter from Tsar Mikhail Fedorovich to his son-in-law. It states that Suzanin was tested by Polish and Lithuanian men and tortured to death, but it does not mention him leading an enemy detachment anywhere. He was likely killed for refusing to reveal the Tsar's whereabouts. That's a heroism in itself, but much more local and less cinematic. The story of impassable swamps and a conscious choice to face death for the sake of salvation emerged much later in the works of 18th and 19th century historians. The legend gradually accumulated details, transforming from a domestic tragedy into an epic drama. There are no convincing historical proofs that Suzanin led the Poles into the swamp. This most vivid aspect of his feat is likely a beautiful fabrication. The myth proves stronger than the truth because it fulfilled a powerful societal need. The nation required a hero from the people, and it created one, adding a dramatic twist to the real story of tragic death. The truth may likely be that Ivan Suzanin was a loyal man who fell at the hands of invaders, but his act of heroism lay not in cunning, but in resilience. He didn't deceive his enemies, he simply did not succumb to them. From the hero whose biography was embellished, let's move to a queen, whose image was, conversely, unfairly deprived of depth and human traits. Myth number 8. The Black Dress of the Cheerful Queen. The Victorian Era. In our minds, images of strictness, primness, and suppressed emotions immediately come to mind. And leading this image is Queen Victoria herself. We envision her as an eternally grieving widow in a black dress, a stern matron who famously declared, "We are not amused." Her name has become synonymous with puritanical morality, hypocrisy, and a complete lack of humor. We believed in this portrayal because it perfectly matched our stereotypes about this era. Victoria the Puritan is a convenient symbol onto which all clichés of the Victorian era can be hung. Women tightly laced in corsets, afraid to reveal an ankle, men with stone-cold faces, a society where any display of passion was deemed inappropriate. Her prolonged mourning for her husband, Prince Albert, seemed to reinforce this image. She became a living embodiment of restraint and duty, an icon of an age named after her. This myth took root because it is simple and easy to understand. It creates a clear, albeit lifeless, portrait. But what if behind this dark facade lay a lively, passionate woman who loved to have fun? Let's look into her personal diaries and letters, which she kept throughout her life. There we will find a very different Victoria. In her youth, she adored dancing and could waltz until dawn. She was an ardent fan of opera and theater. Her correspondence with her husband Albert is filled with tenderness, passion, and playful humor. She was a talented artist and sang beautifully. Even after Albert's death, plunging into deep mourning, she did not turn into an emotionless statue. She found solace in her friendships, in her children and grandchildren, and in managing a vast empire. As for her strictness, in her personal collection, which became public many decades later, drawings and figurines of an erotic nature were discovered. She was a woman of her era, but not a caricature of it. She appreciated humor, loved Scottish folk dances, and could laugh wholeheartedly. The legendary phrase, "we are not amused," is likely apocryphal, attributed to her to enhance the image of a stern ruler. The myth of the Puritan Victoria endured because it transformed a complex, multifaceted person into a flat symbol. It was easier for us to believe in a walking stereotype than in a living person with her passions, weaknesses, and joys. The truth is that Queen Victoria was not a lifeless monument to her age, but its beating heart, full of passion and love for life. Moving from misconceptions about people to misconceptions about places, let's explore a wonder of the world that may have never existed where we thought it did. Myth number 9. Gardens lost in the sands of time. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Just the name conjures images of incredible luxury and engineering genius. Multi-tiered terraces rising to the sky, adorned with exotic flowers and trees. Water, lifted by ingenious mechanisms from the Euphrates River to irrigate this man-made oasis in the scorching Mesopotamia. Legend has it that this wonder of the world was built by King Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BC. For his beloved wife Amytis, who longed for the green hills of her homeland Media. This story has traveled from one historical account to another for centuries. We believed in it because it is incredibly romantic. It was not just an architectural masterpiece, but a grand gesture of love, a monument to royal passion capable of making the desert bloom. The image of a longing queen and an all-powerful king, willing to do anything for her smile, has captivated hearts. Since the 19th century, archaeologists have dug through the hills of ancient Babylon, hoping to find any trace of this wonder. We desperately wanted this beautiful legend to be true. But what if we were looking in the wrong place? What if the gardens existed, but in an entirely different location and were built by another ruler? The problem is that, despite all the efforts, no convincing archaeological evidence of the gardens in Babylon has ever been found. Moreover, in the extensive Babylonian cuneiform texts detailing King Nebuchadnezzar's deeds and building projects, there isn't a single mention of any grand gardens. This fact has puzzled historians for a long time. However, in recent decades, a compelling theory has emerged that turns everything upside down. British Assyriologist Stephanie Dalley proposed that a historical mix-up occurred. The legendary gardens did exist, but not in Babylon. They were in Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and built not by Nebuchadnezzar, but by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, roughly 100 years earlier. Numerous Assyrian texts describe the creation of a magnificent garden at the palace in Nineveh, complete with terraces, exotic plants, and an intricate water supply system. Sennacherib even boasted that he created a wonder for all peoples. So why the confusion? Likely because after the conquest of Babylon by Assyria, Nineveh was sometimes referred to as the New Babylon. Greek historians, writing their accounts centuries later, may have simply mixed up the two cities and attributed the Assyrian wonder to the more famous Babylonian king. The myth of the Babylonian gardens endured so long because of the power of the romantic story and the authority of ancient authors. The truth is likely that we admired a wonder, attributing it to the wrong city and the wrong creator. The gardens weren't lost. We just searched for them in the wrong place. From a lost wonder of the world, let's move on to another lost city that was never really lost. Myth number 10. The city that was never lost. High in the Andes, amidst the mists shrouding the mountain peaks, lies an ancient city hidden from prying eyes. Stone terraces, temples, palaces, and perfectly fitted granite blocks. This is Machu Picchu, the lost city of the Incas. The legend we know tells that this was a secret citadel, the last refuge of the Inca nobility, which the Spanish conquistadors never discovered. It wasn't until 1911 that American explorer Hiram Bingham, making his way through impenetrable jungles, discovered this city for the world, revealing an untouched monument to a great civilization. This story takes one's breath away. It turns archaeology into an adventure novel. The image of the daring explorer uncovering a lost world has become iconic. We believed in this myth because it flattered our Western ego. He created a narrative where the civilized world discovers the wild and forgotten corners of the planet. The idea that an entire city could have been completely hidden from the Spaniards and then remained unnoticed for centuries added an aura of mystery and uniqueness to Machu Picchu. We wanted to believe in the tale of discovery because it was more exciting than the prosaic reality. But what if this city was never truly lost? Let's take a closer look. When Hiram Bingham reached Machu Picchu, he was not alone. He was guided there by a local Quechua farmer named Melchor Arteaga. At the top, Bingham found several farming families who lived there, cultivated ancient terraces, and were well aware of the ruins' existence. For the locals, this city was never lost. They called it Huayna Picchu, or simply Picchu, and it was part of their world, their story passed down through generations. As for the Spaniards, there is no convincing evidence that they were unaware of the city. Most likely, after the decline of the Inca Empire, Machu Picchu, located in a remote area, simply lost its strategic and economic importance. The Spaniards might have known about it, but did not find it necessary to invest their efforts in conquering and colonizing it. It wasn't secret, it was just uninteresting to them. Hiram Bingham's role was not that he discovered the city, but that he brought it to the attention of the global scientific community. He was a brilliant promoter who recognized the potential of this place and created an exciting legend around it. The myth of the lost city was a product of his self-promotion and our desire to believe in wondrous discoveries. The truth is that Machu Picchu was not discovered, it was presented to the world. Its true guardians, the locals, had always been there, quietly living among the ruins of a great empire, until a man from the West arrived and claimed their home as his discovery. From ancient ruins shrouded in myths, let's now transition to a modern marvel of engineering, whose greatness we have also come to measure by outdated standards. Myth number 11, the Golden Gate to the Past. Its silhouette is recognized around the world. Two massive pylons in international orange piercing through the fog, elegant curves of steel cables stretched across the strait connecting San Francisco Bay to the Pacific Ocean, the Golden Gate Bridge. For many, it remains a symbol not only of the city, but also of engineering triumph, the most grandiose suspension bridge on the planet. When it was built in the 1930s, it was a true revolution. It defied the elements, strong currents, salty fog, and seismic activity. In the minds of millions of people, especially those who grew up watching films and postcards from the mid-20th century, it remains the one and only. We believe this because the Golden Gate Bridge is not just a structure, it's a pop culture icon. Its image is so widely reproduced and so monumental that it feels like nothing could ever surpass it. He has become the archetype of the Great Bridge, and we continue to cling to this image even as reality has advanced far beyond it. We tend to freeze greatness at a specific moment in time. We remember him as a champion and are hesitant to compare this fact with modernity. But time and engineering have not stood still. Let's open the record books and look at the current figures, measured not in words, but in meters. When it was opened in 1937, the Golden Gate Bridge was indeed the longest suspension bridge in the world. Its main span measured 1,280 meters, a remarkable achievement for that time. It held that title for nearly 3 decades. Today, however, it doesn't even rank in the top 10. The mantle of supremacy has long been taken over by other giants. Currently, the longest suspension bridge in the world is the Akashi Kaikyo Bridge in Japan, which opened in 1995. Its central span measures 1,991 meters, nearly double that of the Golden Gate Bridge. Following it are bridges in China, Turkey, and South Korea. Engineering has advanced so far that the records of the 30s now seem modest. The myth of the Golden Gate's supremacy persists because its cultural significance has proven more enduring than its engineering record. It remains a symbol not because it is the longest, but because it was the first to boldly push the boundaries of what was possible. The truth is that the Golden Gate Bridge is a great veteran that has made way for new champions, but will forever hold a place in the Hall of Fame. From this man-made marvel of steel, let's transition to a miracle of clay, the entire army, whose purpose we also understood too narrowly. Myth number 12, the army that brought more than death. Imagine the dimness of an underground tomb. In eternal formation, shoulder to shoulder, stand thousands of clay warriors in full battle gear, archers, infantry, charioteers. This is the terracotta army, created over 2,000 years ago to guard the first emperor of unified China, Qin Shi Huang, in the afterlife. The picture painted for us is clear and ominous. This silent army was meant to protect its master from enemies and demons in the afterworld, continuing his conquests even in the realm of the dead. Each warrior is a guardian, each horse, a combat unit. The army's purpose is war and protection. We believe this narrative because it makes sense and aligns with our idea of ancient rulers obsessed with immortality and power. The image of an emperor who cannot part with his army, even in death, is both impressive and frightening. It speaks of boundless power and self-obsession. The military interpretation seems obvious. Since they are warriors, they must be for war. We saw clay soldiers and immediately assigned them a function without delving into details. But what if this is not just an army? What if it is a replica of an entire world that the emperor wanted to take with him? Let's take a closer look at the findings of archaeologists. Yes, the vast majority of the figures are warriors. However, as the excavations continued, scholars began to uncover something else. They discovered figures of officials and scribes holding scrolls. They found acrobats frozen in incredible poses, musicians with their instruments, and strongmen. There were even bronze figures of waterfowl found in an underground garden with an artificial river. It becomes clear that Qin Shi Huang was not just building an elaborate tomb with guards. He was recreating an exact replica of his court, his empire, encompassing all its aspects, not only military but administrative and cultural as well. He wanted to be surrounded in the afterlife by the same environment he was accustomed to during his lifetime. The warriors were merely a part of this grand project, possibly the most numerous, but not the only aspect. The myth of the army's purely military function arose because warriors were the first to be discovered, and their appearance made a striking impression. This version was simple and compelling. The truth, however, is far more complex and ambitious. The terracotta army is not just a guard detail. It is a time-frozen snapshot of an entire civilization, an attempt to carry into eternity not only military strength, but also the entire structure of the imperial court, with its bureaucracy, art, and entertainment. Now, let's turn from earthly armies and empires to the forces of nature and the eras we often envision in overly monochromatic tones. Myth number 13. The White Desert that did not cover the world. Say the phrase Ice Age, and an image of an endless white desert immediately comes to mind. A planet frozen in ice from pole to pole. Mammoths and saber-toothed tigers wandering across a snowy tundra against the backdrop of giant glaciers beneath a low, cold sun. We tend to think of the Ice Age as a global and total glaciation, when nearly the entire Earth transformed into one giant ice rink. This image has been firmly established thanks to popular movies, cartoons, and books. It's dramatic and easy to visualize. We believed it because the idea of a totally frozen planet captivates the imagination. It is a scenario of global catastrophe that intrigues and terrifies simultaneously. The simplification of Ice Age equals all Earth covered in ice was convenient and understandable. It created a clear and memorable picture that did not require complicated climatological explanations. But what if this picture is a gross exaggeration? What if ice was merely a guest across much of the planet, rather than its absolute ruler? Let's open up paleoclimatic maps and take a look at the actual distribution of glaciers during peak glacial periods. The truth is that even at the harshest moments of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, glaciers covered only about 30% of the land. Yes, that is a vast area. Huge ice sheets lay over much of North America and Northern Europe, including Scandinavia and the British Isles. However, vast areas of Eurasia, including much of Siberia, were not covered by continuous ice due to an overly dry climate. As for the equatorial and tropical regions, there was no talk of complete glaciation. Yes, the climate became cooler and drier, and in some places, forests gave way to savannas, but the tropical rainforests of the Amazon, Congo, and Southeast Asia continued to thrive. Vast areas of Africa, South America, and Australia remained ice-free. The world was not uniformly white. It was a mosaic. In some places, glaciers advanced. In others, forests retreated. And in yet others, deserts expanded. The myth of total glaciation survived because it was simple and visually striking. However, reality, as always, was more complex, diverse, and interesting. The planet was not dying under an icy blanket. It was changing, adapting, and life continued to thrive even in the harshest conditions. Now, let's move from a global chill that was not so global to a global warming in the ocean, which turned out to be more predictable than we thought. Myth number 14, an uninvited guest from the ocean depths, El Niño. For many, this word evokes the image of a sudden and unpredictable natural disaster. Anomalously warm currents in the Pacific Ocean, appearing out of nowhere and causing chaos around the globe. Droughts in Australia, floods in Peru, hurricanes in America. The news often presents it as a caprice of nature, an irregular anomaly that is impossible to predict. We tend to view El Niño as a climatic wildcard, an incidental event that disrupts global weather patterns. This belief in its unpredictability was convenient. It relieved us of responsibility, turning climate disasters into matters of blind chance with which nothing can be done. We believe this because the idea of chaotic and unpredictable nature is both frightening and comforting. If it's a coincidence, then no one is to blame, and all we can do is ride out the storm. But what if this uninvited guest arrives on schedule? What if its visits have some logic, albeit not strict? Let's turn to modern climatology and oceanography data. Scientists studying this phenomenon have long recognized that El Niño is not a random anomaly, but part of a complex cyclical process known as the Southern Oscillation. This cycle has two phases, warm, El Niño, and cool, La Niña, as well as a neutral phase. And this cycle repeats itself at certain intervals, on average every 2 to 7 years. It is not chaos, it is an oscillatory system. Moreover, modern science has made significant advancements in predicting this phenomenon. With satellite observations of sea surface temperatures, buoys measuring temperatures at depth, and complex computer models, climatologists can forecast the onset of El Niño several months or even up to 6 months before its peak. The accuracy of these forecasts continues to improve. We are no longer blind kittens. We are clear-eyed observers capable of preparing for upcoming changes. The myth of El Niño's unpredictability is a legacy of the past when we lacked the tools to study it. Today, it's not just an unpredictable anomaly, it's actually a well-studied and predictable climate pattern. The truth is, we are no longer at the mercy of blind chance. We can anticipate the arrival of El Niño and mitigate its effects. We just don't always use this knowledge. From ocean currents, which turned out to be less chaotic than we thought, let's shift to a desert that is less waterless than imagined. Myth number 15, the desert that remembers the taste of rain. The Atacama Desert in Chile, the driest place on Earth. In our minds, it's the ultimate extreme of drought, a place where it hasn't rained for hundreds or even thousands of years. We envision a Martian landscape, a scorched, lifeless land where no blade of grass could survive. Photos from the region support this image, cracked clay, salt flats, and rocky outcrops stretching to the horizon. The legend of Atacama's eternal drought has become the benchmark against which all other deserts are compared. We believe it because we are drawn to absolute records. The driest place, a location where it never rains. It sounds impressive. It paints a picture of an extreme, alien environment on our own planet. And this image is so powerful that we overlook small details that contradict it. We take the metaphor as literal fact. But what if, even in this realm of drought, the skies occasionally open up? Let's examine weather reports and eyewitness accounts. Yes, Atacama is an incredibly dry place. In some central areas, there are indeed weather stations that haven't recorded any significant rainfall for decades. However, claiming that it hasn't rained there for 100 years is an exaggeration. Every few decades, usually linked to the same El Niño phenomenon, moist air masses do arrive in the desert, bringing rain to the parched earth. And then, a miracle happens. The desert briefly transforms into a carpet of flowers. Seeds that have lain dormant in the dry soil for decades awaken and produce millions of pink, purple, and yellow blooms. This phenomenon is known as the flowering desert, Desierto Florido, and has become a tourist attraction. Furthermore, in the coastal regions of Atacama, though it may not rain, thick fogs known as camanchaca roll in from the ocean. This moisture condenses on plants and supports unique ecosystems known as fog oases. The myth of Atacama's eternal and absolute dryness is shattered by reality. It's not completely devoid of water. Instead, it exists in a state of extreme anticipation for moisture. The myth persisted because it was simple and striking. The truth, as always, is more nuanced, and in this case, more beautiful. It speaks not of a dead land, but of an incredible, hidden thirst for life. From a desert on Earth that isn't as lifeless as we thought, let's shift our gaze to a sunset on another planet that isn't as different from ours. Myth number 16, a Martian sunset in earthly hues. Space has always stirred our imagination, and Mars in particular. The red planet, our nearest neighbor, a potential second home for humanity. We eagerly gaze at the photographs sent back by rovers, trying to envision what it would be like to stand on its surface. One of the most popular and romantic images is that of a Martian sunset. In countless sci-fi films and artwork by visionary artists, it's often depicted as blue. This idea has almost become an axiom. On Earth, the sky is blue while sunsets are red. Therefore, on Mars, where the daytime sky has a reddish-pink hue, the sunset must be blue. This logic, based on contrast, seemed elegant and convincing. We embrace the idea of a blue Martian sunset because it is beautiful and poetic. It creates an image of an otherworldly mirrored existence. A blue sun setting behind a red horizon is a powerful visual that emphasizes the strangeness and the mysterious beauty of another planet. This myth became so beloved that it transformed into an almost accepted fact, passing from one source to another. But what do the cameras on Mars rovers actually see when they observe the sun setting below the horizon? Let's take a look at the real, unedited images sent back from the Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity rovers. Yes, there are blue tones in the Martian sunset. However, it's not the rich, deep blue that we see in our daytime sky. The actual Martian sunset has more of a bluish gray or pale blue tint, and this color is mostly concentrated in the halo around the sun. The rest of the sky remains a reddish yellow. This effect results from light scattering on tiny dust particles in the Martian atmosphere. These particles let blue light travel straight to the observer, while red light gets scattered across the sky. The effect does exist, but it's much more subdued and localized than we tend to imagine. The myth of the vivid blue sunset is an artistic exaggeration, amplifying a real yet subtler phenomenon. We took a hint of blue and painted the entire sky with it. The truth is that the Martian sunset is unique and beautiful in its own right, but it is not simply an inversion of Earth's. It's a more complex and muted palette that reminds us, while the laws of physics are the same everywhere, they manifest differently. Now, let's shift from myths about the outside world to myths about the inner world, focusing on the most complex and mysterious organ, the human brain. Myth number 17, 90% of the sleeping giant. This may be one of the most enduring and inspiring myths about human potential. We only use 10% of our brains. The other 90% is untapped, dormant potential, a massive resource just waiting to be awakened. If we could access it, we would attain superhuman abilities, telekinesis, phenomenal memory, genius-level intelligence. This idea has inspired countless self-help books, personal development workshops, and Hollywood blockbusters. We have so readily believed in this myth because it gives us hope. It tells us that each of us is a hidden genius, and that our current limitations are not the end, but just a small part of our true potential. This is an incredibly flattering and comforting thought. It promises a simple path to greatness. We just need to find the key to the other 90%. This myth is a perfect marketing tool, selling the dream of limitless potential. It has become so deeply entrenched that even seemingly serious people repeat it. But what if this sleeping giant is nothing but a fiction? What if our brains are working at full capacity almost all the time? Let's turn to the data from modern neurobiology. Techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and positron emission tomography, PET, allow scientists to see which areas of the brain are active at any given moment. And these studies clearly show that throughout the day, we use virtually all parts of our brains. Even when we sleep, the brain is hard at work, processing information, sorting memories, and managing vital functions. There are no sleeping or silent areas. If any part of the brain is damaged due to injury or illness, it almost always leads to serious consequences: loss of speech, memory, or motor functions. If 90% of the brain were unnecessary, most traumatic brain injuries would go unnoticed. Moreover, the brain is an extremely energy-consuming organ. It uses about 20% of the body's total energy, despite only making up 2% of body mass. Evolution is a very economical process. It would never allow such an expensive organ to develop and exist if it were only running at 10% capacity. So where did this myth come from? Its origins are murky. It's attributed to Albert Einstein, who never said anything of the sort, and American psychologist William James, who metaphorically discussed unrealized mental potential. But this metaphor was taken literally and turned into a pseudoscientific fact. The truth is, we use 100% of our brains. It's just that not all parts are active at the same time. The myth of 10% is a nice story that prevents us from appreciating what we already have: an incredibly complex and efficient organ that is constantly at work. From the myth about hidden brain potential, let's move to the myth about age-related limitations in learning, which is also proven to be greatly exaggerated. Myth number 18. The window that doesn't close. Learn a language while you're young. It's too late for adults. Their brains just aren't the same. Many have heard this phrase. In our society, there's a belief that there is a critical period for learning languages, which ends in adolescence. Children, like sponges, soak up new words and grammatical structures effortlessly, while adults struggle through the thickets of articles and irregular verbs with great difficulty and questionable results. We believe this because the myth provides a convenient excuse for our laziness or failures. It's easier to say, "I'm too old for this," than to admit a lack of motivation or time. Moreover, we see how easily immigrant children pick up a new language, which seems to confirm the theory. The image of the stubborn adult brain, incapable of flexibility, has become almost an axiom. This belief creates a psychological barrier that prevents many adults from even starting to learn a new language. But what if this window of opportunity never actually shuts completely? What if adults have their own unique advantages when it comes to language learning? Let's take a look at findings from modern linguistic and neurobiological research. Yes, children do have an advantage in one specific area: mastering pronunciation. Their brains and speech apparatus are more flexible, allowing them to imitate sounds and achieve an accent indistinguishable from a native speaker. But this is where their apparent advantages end. In all other aspects, learning grammar, building vocabulary, understanding complex abstract concepts, adults often learn faster and more effectively than children. Adults possess what children lack: developed analytical thinking, life experience to draw from, and, most importantly, conscious motivation. An adult can use mnemonic techniques, comprehend grammatical rules as a logical system rather than just memorizing them. Numerous studies show that adults who engage intensely and purposefully can reach high levels of language proficiency in a much shorter time than a child. The myth of the late start persists because it conflates different aspects of language into one notion. We hear a foreign accent in an adult and mistakenly conclude that they have poorly learned the language, overlooking their rich vocabulary and solid grasp of grammar. The truth is that languages can and should be learned at any age. While achieving perfect pronunciation might be harder, in every other respect, an adult learner has every chance to surpass a child. The brain doesn't stiffen, it simply changes its learning strategies. Now, moving from myths about the brain and learning to myths about the body, let's discuss a sound we once considered harmless but turned out to be a warning signal. Myth number 19. The lullaby that lulls danger away. Snoring. That deep, rattling sound made by a sleeping person has long been the subject of jokes, anecdotes, and family squabbles. In the public consciousness, it's viewed as a nuisance but ultimately harmless feature. Sure, someone snores and disturbs others' sleep, but for them, it's just an unpleasant noise, nothing more. We've come to see snoring as merely an acoustic issue, a funny quirk that can be tolerated or drowned out with earplugs. We believed in its harmlessness because it was easier that way. Acknowledging that snoring might be a symptom of a serious condition means confronting the necessity to take action, visit a doctor, or change one's lifestyle. It's much easier to joke about it or blame it on fatigue or an uncomfortable pillow. This myth of just noise has served as a form of psychological defense, a way to ignore a problem that seems too mundane to be dangerous. But what if this lullaby is actually an SOS signal from our body? Let's listen to what sleep doctors say. Chronic loud snoring, in the overwhelming majority of cases, is not just sound. It is a sign that the airways are narrowed during sleep, making it difficult for air to pass through. Often, it is a symptom of a dangerous condition called obstructive sleep apnea. Apnea refers to temporary pauses in breathing while sleeping. A person snores, then experiences a sinister silence for 10 to 30 seconds or even up to a minute before gasping and resuming breathing. During this time, the brain experiences oxygen deprivation. There can be hundreds of such pauses in a single night. The body does not get proper rest and is constantly in a state of stress. The consequences of apnea are severe. A sharp increase in the risk of heart attacks, strokes, hypertension, and diabetes. A person feels exhausted and sleepy during the day, increasing the risk of accidents on the road. The myth of snoring being harmless is deadly. It causes people to ignore this alarming symptom for years until it is too late. The truth is that snoring is not an acoustic problem, but a medical one. It should be treated seriously, like any other signal of distress from the body. From the hidden threat we cannot hear, let's move to the healing process that we misunderstand. Myth number 20, a wound that needs air. Each of us scraped our knees as children. We remember the advice given to us by adults. Let the wound breathe, it will heal faster. The idea that a wound needs to be opened to fresh air to form a dry scab, under which healing occurs, seems intuitively right. Air is associated with life and cleanliness, while a bandage feels stuffy and damp. We believe this because it is simple and logical. A dry scab looks like a natural protective barrier, and we think that by leaving the wound open, we're helping nature do its job. This myth has been passed down through generations as time-tested folk wisdom. We were afraid that if a wound was covered, it would fester, leading to complications. But what if this folk wisdom contradicts modern knowledge about tissue regeneration? What if, in trying to help, we are actually slowing down the healing process? Let's take a look at contemporary medical protocols and studies on wound treatment. They tell us the exact opposite. For optimal healing, a wound requires a not dry, but moderately moist environment. Why? The healing process involves the migration of new cells, epithelium, which must crawl from the edges of the wound to its center to close the defect. In a dry environment, beneath a tough crust, it is very challenging for cells to heal. They must navigate underneath the scab, which slows down the process and often results in a rougher scar. However, in a moist environment, cells can move freely and quickly. Modern dressings, such as hydrocolloid and gel types, create this ideal moist environment. Additionally, the dressing serves two other crucial functions. First, it protects the wound from dirt and bacteria, preventing infection. An open wound is a gateway to infection. Second, it maintains a consistent temperature and shields the growing cells from mechanical damage. The myth of a breathing wound persists because it is based on outdated beliefs and common logic. The truth, supported by decades of clinical practice, is that moist healing under a dressing is the gold standard. It is faster, less painful, and results in less noticeable scarring. A wound does not breathe air. It heals through complex cellular processes that require protection and the right microclimate. Now, let's move from bodily myths to those of the supernatural, to superstitions whose roots we have long forgotten. Myth number 21. The triangle that must not be violated. Walking under a ladder is said to bring bad luck. This is one of the most well-known and widespread superstitions in the Western world. Even the least superstitious people instinctively avoid it, just in case. We follow this rule automatically, without considering its origins. Why a ladder? Why is it considered so dangerous? In our minds, it is simply an axiom. Walking under a ladder is forbidden. End of discussion. We believe in this because superstitions often operate at a subconscious level. They are passed down as a cultural code, and their power lies in their irrationality. We do not seek a logical explanation. We accept the prohibition as a given. Moreover, there's a practical consideration. Something might fall from the ladder. However, the superstitious fear runs deeper than simple caution. So, where did this strange prohibition come from? Its roots go back to medieval Europe and are closely tied to Christian symbolism. A ladder leaning against a wall forms a triangle. In Christianity, the triangle is a sacred symbol representing the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Walking through this triangle was seen as breaking or desecrating a sacred space, showing disrespect to the Trinity. This was considered blasphemy, likely to incur divine wrath or invoke the devil. Thus, it was not merely a superstition about bad luck, but a deeply religious prohibition. There was also a darker aspect. In medieval England, those condemned to death were led to the gallows under a ladder. Walking beneath it symbolically meant facing one's own death. Over time, the religious and criminal connotations faded away, but the irrational fear remained. The myth survived because it transformed from a complex symbolic act into a simple and easily remembered rule. We no longer needed to know about the Trinity or gallows. All we had to remember was, stairs equals bad. The truth is that by avoiding stairs today, we unconsciously follow the religious dogmas and fears of people who lived more than 500 years ago. This is not merely a superstition. It's an echo of a bygone era, frozen in our daily habits. From one superstition tied to form, let's move to another linked to time and cultural differences. Myth number 22. Clocks that count the wrong time. Giving a clock as a gift is considered bad luck. It's said to bring separation or conflict, and in the darkest scenarios, even to shorten the life of the person receiving it. Many people instinctively offer the gift giver a coin when they receive a clock, as if redeeming it to neutralize the bad omen. This superstition is quite widespread, and we approach it with a certain unease. We believe in it because clocks are powerful symbols. They measure time, and time is life itself. Interfering with this process, by giving someone a tool that counts down to the inevitable end, seems sacred and potentially dangerous. The idea that clocks count the time until separation sounds both poetic and tragic, making the superstition more memorable. But where does this fear actually come from? Why did clocks become such an unlucky gift? If we dig into European tradition, we won't find deep historical roots for this superstition. Yes, there were local beliefs, but it became widespread only relatively recently. The true source of this fear lies far to the east, in China. In Chinese culture, this superstition has a very specific and logical explanation, from a phonetic perspective. The phrase to give clocks, 送钟, sounds exactly like the phrase to send someone off on their final journey, or to bury, 送钟. For a Chinese person, giving a clock is akin to wishing them an early death. This is one of the most serious taboos in gifting etiquette. With the rise of globalization and cultural exchange, this Chinese superstition gradually permeated the Western world, but without its original linguistic explanation. It lost its root but retained its form. We adopted the fear without understanding its cause. Ultimately, in our culture, it has grown new interpretations about separation, conflict, and so on. The myth survived because it resonated with our subconscious fears related to time and the finiteness of existence. We fill the foreign form with our own content. The truth is that for most of us, this superstition is an imported cultural artifact, a phonetic wordplay from a foreign language that we have mistaken for a universal mystical truth. Now, let's turn from sounds that bring misfortune to another sound believed to blow prosperity out of the home. Myth number 23. Whistling blows wealth away. Don't whistle in the house, you'll have no money. This childhood prohibition seems one of the strangest and most irrational. What could be the connection between a simple whistle and financial well-being? However, many people still instinctively frown upon whistling indoors, especially among the older generation. We adhere to this rule because it has been ingrained in us from a young age as an unquestionable truth that needs no explanation. It's part of our everyday folklore, much like the prohibitions against sitting on a table or passing things across a threshold. We believe in it, or at least we follow the ritual out of respect for traditions, without even trying to understand their logic. For us, it's simply another forbidden rule, nothing more. Yet, this seemingly absurd superstition has deep mythological roots tied to the pagan beliefs of our ancestors. For the ancient Slavs, whistling was not just a sound, it was a language of the elements, particularly that of the wind. To whistle meant to summon the wind, to mimic it. The wind is a dual force, uncontrollable. On one hand, it could be helpful, turning the sails of windmills. But on the other hand, it brought storms and hurricanes that could rip roofs off, break trees, and carry everything in its path. Whistling in the home, in one's protected space, meant calling this destructive force inside. It was believed that whistling could blow away all good fortune from the house, literally scattering wealth to the wind. There was also an even more sinister connotation. Whistling was considered the language of dark forces, spirits, forest dwellers, and demons. A person whistling in their home was metaphorically inviting them in, opening the door to them. And these dark forces certainly wouldn't bring prosperity. Instead, they would steal everything and bring misfortune. Thus, the prohibition against whistling indoors echoes an ancient fear of the uncontrollable forces of nature and the other world. The myth has persisted, as like many other superstitions, it has lost its original explanation but retained the form of the taboo. We may have forgotten about the pagan gods of wind and dark spirits, but the fear of whistling away money remains in our cultural memory. The truth is, this prohibition is not an economic rule, but an ancient magical ritual meant to protect the home from chaos and evil. Moving from whistling, which invites trouble, let's talk about shards of glass, which, according to superstition, condemn you to 7 years of misfortune. Myth number 24. 7 years bound in shards. The sound of a shattered mirror. Even for the biggest skeptic, this sound is unsettling. The superstition connected to it is one of the most enduring and frightening. To break a mirror means inviting 7 years of bad luck upon oneself. The number 7 sounds so specific and inescapable that it sends chills down the spine. To avoid this curse, people have come up with entire rituals, collecting the shards without looking at them, rinsing them under running water, burying them in the ground. We either believe in this or, at the very least, feel anxious about it, because a mirror is not just a decorative object. Since ancient times, it has been attributed with mystical properties. It serves as a window to another world, a twin of our reality. Most importantly, it reflects our soul. The idea that breaking the reflection harms our very essence, our soul, is a powerful and archetypical notion. But why specifically 7 years? Where did this mystical number come from? The origins of this superstition can be traced back to ancient Rome. The Romans were among the first to create mirrors out of glass, although they were often cloudy and expensive. They believed that a mirror reflects not just one's appearance, but also the soul of a person. To break a mirror meant to damage one's soul, incurring the wrath of the gods. But what's the deal with 7 years? The Romans also believed in the cyclical nature of life. They thought that a person's body and soul undergo a complete renewal every 7 years. Therefore, if the soul was harmed by a broken mirror, it required an entire 7-year cycle to heal and recover. 7 years of misfortune is not just a random period, it's the time needed for the soul to regenerate. It was a form of spiritual quarantine. This myth survived and spread throughout Europe because it combined the mystical horror of soul injury with a specific, frightening timeline for punishment. Over time, the original Roman reasoning faded away, but the formula, broken mirror equals 7 years of bad luck, proved to be incredibly resilient. The truth is that this superstition is not just blind fear, it is a remnant of ancient Roman medicine and philosophy that has somehow persisted to this day. Every time we fear broken glass, we unconsciously tap into the beliefs of those who lived 2,000 years ago. Now, let's move from ancient superstitions to more modern artifacts and phrases whose origins we often confuse as well. Myth number 25. The cry of the conqueror assigned to the vanquished. Vae victis! Woe to the vanquished! This famous Latin phrase has become a symbol of the ruthless law of the strong, a reflection of the merciless victor imposing his will upon the defeated. In our minds, it is firmly associated with ancient Rome, its legions conquering the world. We picture a Roman general, perhaps Julius Caesar himself, throwing this phrase in the faces of the defeated Gauls or other barbarian tribes. It seems so logical. It was the Romans, masters of the world, who could utter such haughty and cruel words. The phrase has become an embodiment of Roman imperialism. We believed in this because it perfectly fits our stereotypical image of ancient Rome as great, powerful, and unyielding. We attributed this phrase to the Romans because it seemed to embody the very essence of their civilization. It became as much a symbol of Rome as the Colosseum or the eagles of the legions. But what if this phrase was not uttered by a victorious Roman, but rather by his enemy? What if it was a cry of humiliation directed at the Romans themselves? Let's delve into Livy's History of Rome and find that very episode. The events date back to 390 BC, during one of the most disgraceful moments in early Roman history. The Gallic tribe of the Senones, led by a chieftain named Brennus, defeated the Roman army and captured the city of Rome itself. The Romans took refuge on the Capitoline Hill, and after a long siege were forced to agree to a humiliating peace, paying a hefty ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold. When the gold was brought in and weighed, the Romans noticed that the Gauls were using fake, heavier weights. They began to protest. Then, the Gallic leader Brennus mockingly threw his heavy sword onto the scales and uttered the infamous phrase, Vae victis. This meant, woe to the vanquished. You are not in a position to argue, you have lost, and now I set the rules. Thus, this phrase was spoken not by a Roman, but against them. It symbolized not their strength, but their humiliation. Over time, as Rome became a great empire, this shameful episode was forgotten, while the striking phrase remained. Ironically, it began to be attributed to the Romans themselves, transforming a symbol of their defeat into one of their victory. This myth endured due to its aphoristic nature and its perfect fit for the new image of Rome as a conqueror. The truth is, one of the most famous Roman phrases is actually a monument to their greatest shame. From this storied phrase that changed its author, let's move to a headgear that we associate with entirely different people. Myth number 26. The gentleman's bowler for the Wild West. The bowler hat. When mentioning this headgear, two images typically spring to mind. Either it's the Victorian-era London gentleman, like Dr. Watson, or characters from the Wild West, bankers, sheriffs, and sometimes famous gunfighters like Butch Cassidy. In countless westerns, the bowler became as emblematic of the era as the cowboy hat or Colt revolver. We tend to think that if the bowler was worn in the West, it was merely an urban fashion imported from Europe. In contrast, the authentic cowboy hat, with its wide brim, was invented by cowboys for protection against the sun and harsh weather. This version seems logical, a practical hat for working in the fields, elegant for the city. But what if the most popular headgear in the Wild West wasn't the Stetson, but the bowler? And what if it was created not for gentlemen, but for a much tougher profession? Let's delve into the archives of hatters and chronicles of the American West. The bowler hat was created in London in 1849 by hatters Thomas and William Bowler. However, the order came not from an aristocrat, but from a gamekeeper named James Locke. He needed a sturdy hat with a low, rounded crown that wouldn't get snagged on low branches while riding through his estate, and that would protect his head from blows. Essentially, the bowler was originally conceived as protective headgear, almost like a helmet. Its durability and compactness made it incredibly popular in the American West. Unlike the cumbersome cowboy hat, the bowler wouldn't be blown away by the wind. It was practical in a fight, and it stayed securely on one's head while riding. Historical photographs reveal that everyone wore bowlers, lawmen, outlaws, and average workers alike. Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, Bat Masterson, all favored the bowler. The famous wide-brimmed cowboy hat known as the Boss of the Plains, created by John Stetson, came later and only became popular by the end of the 19th century, largely due to Hollywood westerns that established this iconic image. The myth that the bowler hat is a gentleman's hat, while the cowboy hat ruled the West, was created by the film industry. The truth is that throughout most of the Wild West era, the most cowboy hat was actually the London bowler, designed to protect a gamekeeper's head from branches. Now, from one cultural symbol whose origins we misunderstood, let's move on to the greatest love story that turns out to be not so original. Myth number 27. The story sadder than many in the world, Romeo and Juliet. This tragedy by William Shakespeare is the epitome of a tale about forbidden love, a feud between families that destroys young lovers. The names of the characters have become synonymous with the theme. We consider this play the pinnacle of Shakespeare's work, a unique and brilliant creation born from the depths of his poetic talent. The entire world knows the story, conceived by the great English playwright in Verona. We believed in the originality of this plot because Shakespeare's genius is so dazzling that it's hard for us to imagine he could have borrowed ideas. We want to believe that the greatest works of art are born from nothing, as a flash of divine inspiration. Acknowledging that Romeo and Juliet is essentially a brilliant reinterpretation of existing material seems almost sacrilegious. It diminishes, or so we think, the greatness of the author. But what if Shakespeare was not so much an inventor as a brilliant arranger? What if he took a well-known melody and turned it into an immortal symphony? Let's trace the journey of this plot through Renaissance literature. The story of two lovers from feuding families was not invented by Shakespeare. Long before him, it already existed in Italian literature. In 1476, Mazzuchino Salernitano wrote a novella about Mariotto and Giannozza from Siena, where there is already a secret marriage, banishment, false news of death, and suicide in a tomb. In 1530, Luigi da Porto relocated the tale to Verona, gave the characters the names Romeo and Juliet, and introduced the theme of the feud between the Montagues and Capulets. Then, in 1554, Matteo Bandello further expanded and dramatized this story. It was Bandello's version that became the most popular. It was translated into French and then into English as Arthur Brooks' poem titled The Tragical History of Romeus and Juliet in 1562. This poem served as the direct source for Shakespeare's play. He did not merely borrow the plot, he took a ready-made framework, characters, and key plot twists. So, what was his genius? It lay in transforming a rather moralistic and at times cumbersome tale into a masterpiece of world drama. He deepened the characters, added secondary figures like Mercutio and the nurse, and, most importantly, crafted it all in brilliant verse, infusing the story with incredible poetic power and tragedy. The myth of originality in the plot persists because we often confuse the storyline with its artistic expression. The truth is that Shakespeare did not invent the story of Romeo and Juliet, but he made it immortal. He was not the first to tell it, but he told it better than anyone else. From the borrowed symbol of love, let's transition to the symbol of the state, which was created not by the person we often credit. Myth number 28. The hammer and sickle, forged not by the leader. The hammer and sickle. This symbol is perhaps known worldwide. It became the embodiment of the Soviet Union, communist ideology, and the union of workers and peasants. This concise and powerful emblem adorned the coat of arms and flag of a vast country, visible everywhere, from pins to architectural reliefs. In public perception, the creation of such an important ideological symbol is often attributed personally to the leader of the revolution, Vladimir Lenin. It seems logical that he, the chief theorist and practitioner of the new state, designed or at least approved its final version. This version flatters the idea of a genius leader who meticulously planned everything, from grand strategy to the smallest details of state symbolism. We believed in this because it simplified history, reducing a complex process of collective creativity to the will of one individual. Lenin, as the creator of everything Soviet, is a convenient and understandable myth. But what if the leader of the proletariat had no direct connection to the creation of this symbol? What if its author was a humble artist whose name faded into the background of great events? Let's take a look into the archives of early Soviet art. In the summer of 1918, in the young Soviet Republic, preparations were underway to celebrate the first anniversary of the October Revolution. The authorities in Moscow needed to decorate the Zamoskvorecha district. This assignment was given to artist Yevgeny Kamzolkin. Contemplating a symbol that would reflect the essence of the new state, the union of workers and peasants, he created this brilliant combination: the crossed sickle as a symbol of the peasantry and the hammer as a symbol of the working class. The sketch was made for a panel that was to adorn Serpukhov Square. The symbol turned out to be so successful, expressive, and clear that it caught attention. Lenin saw it on one of the May Day posters and approved it, after which the symbol began its triumphant journey. The final version of the coat of arms, featuring the hammer and sickle against the backdrop of the globe, was approved collectively at a meeting of the Central Executive Committee, but the idea, the brilliant combination itself, belonged to Kamzolkin. Notably, the artist was not a communist and came from a wealthy mercantile family. He remained a deeply religious person throughout his life, far removed from the ideology for which he created the main symbol. Myth number 29. The corset that wasn't an eternal prison. Victorian England. In our minds, it's an era of suffocating fashion. Women, tied from childhood in rigid corsets made from whalebone, which deformed their internal organs and restricted their breathing. We envision the corset as an indispensable part of a woman's wardrobe, worn by all the time, from morning till night, and sometimes even while sleeping. This image of suffering in the name of fashion has become one of the main symbols of women's oppression in the patriarchal society of the 19th century. We believed in it, as it paints a vivid and terrifying picture that perfectly aligns with the feminist narrative of women's liberation from the shackles of the past. Stories of girls fainting from lack of air and displaced ribs have become textbook examples. This myth was reinforced by numerous caricatures of the time and later films that exaggerated reality for dramatic effect. But what if this picture of total corset slavery is a strong exaggeration? What if the corset was less an instrument of torture and more a marker of social status, worn by far fewer people and not at all times? Let's turn to the research of fashion historians and examine the actual wardrobes of that era. Firstly, corsets were primarily worn by women of the middle and upper classes. Peasant women, factory workers, and maids, that is, the overwhelming majority of the female population, simply couldn't afford such luxury and, more importantly, couldn't perform heavy physical labor while wearing one. Their clothing was much looser and more practical. Secondly, even for noble ladies, the corset wasn't a 24/7 prison. There were different types of corsets, tougher ones for formal receptions and balls, and softer, more flexible ones for homeware or activities like horseback riding. The idea that women slept in corsets is a rarity, not the norm. Only the most desperate fashionistas might do that to maintain their wasp waist. The myth of universal and lifelong corset wearing arose from extrapolating high society fashion to the entire population. We took the most extreme example and turned it into a standard. The truth is that while the corset was an important part of fashion, its use was much more differentiated and depended on social class, situation, and a woman's personal choice. It was more a symbol of status than a universal tool of oppression. From the myth of the female body constrained by fashion, we now transition to the last myth, the famous phrase that allegedly defined attitudes toward an entire sphere of life in a vast country. Myth number 30, the phrase that was never broadcast. In the USSR, there is no sex. This phrase has become one of the most famous memes associated with the Soviet Union. It's often used to highlight the hypocrisy, puritanism, and total control the state had over its citizens' personal lives during that era. We picture a Soviet woman seriously declaring this during a televised bridge with America, shocking Western viewers and showcasing the absurdity of Soviet ideology. This story resonates with many because it seems like the perfect anecdote, encapsulating an entire system in just a few words. It's funny, brief, and we feel it holds a deep truth about the Soviet experience as a space devoid of gender and sexuality, where even discussing love was seen as improper. The phrase became a convenient cliché, a label that could be attached to an entire epoch. But what if this phrase, as we know it, was never actually said? What if it was the result of brilliant editing and a misunderstood context? Let's look for that recording of the Leningrad-Boston telebridge titled Women Talk with Women from 1986. During the discussion, an American participant asks a question about sexual exploitation in Soviet advertisements. One of the Soviet participants, Lyudmila Ivanova, the administrator of the Leningrad Hotel, begins to respond. She says, "We have sex. We do not have sex, and we are firmly against it." After that, she continues, "We have love." However, her final statement is almost drowned out by the noise and laughter in the studio. She meant that there was no sexual exploitation in advertising in the USSR, that the word sex wasn't used for commercial purposes as it was in the West, and that relationships between people were built on love, not on sex as a commodity. However, her response was muddled, and the phrase, "we do not have sex," was taken out of context. The American side and subsequent journalists seized on this part, ignoring everything else. Thus, the famous meme was born. The myth that the Soviet woman denied the existence of sexual life in the country stems from misunderstanding, unfortunate wording, and media distortion. The truth is that sex certainly existed in the USSR. But public discussion of the topic was absent, and commercialization didn't happen, which was the point the telebridge participant was trying to make. One awkward phrase taken out of context created a myth that turned out to be more enduring and influential than the complex reality. This concludes our journey through the forgotten archives for today.